All right, be honest. What do you think of the Trudeau government? Don't worry either, because someone may soon contact you to find out. Last year, Liberal governments spent more than $20 million in public funds on opinion polls. That's almost twice as much as 3 years ago. Let's get to the bottom of this. Nicolas Gagnon is the Quebec Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and he's on the line. Hi, Nicolas.
Hi, good morning, sir.
So let me ask you, we know the dollar signs. We know that they spent $20 million, and we know that they spend it on 164 public opinion research studies. But do we know what they were asking?
That's actually a very good question, and that's something that we are hoping the government to eventually show to the public, all the data eventually. Because in the end, the taxpayers are paying for information that we don't have any disclosure of. And what the worst part about it is that, those polls, are they really useful at this point? That's the big question, because we understand that many governments will refer themselves to focus group and polling firms to try to understand what is going on with the population, how their policies are affecting Canadians, and how they can actually conduct more policies to either fix what they have created or try to actually improve people's life. Mm-hmm. But the fact that they have increased so much is clearly an indication that something is going on. And it's not just that. It's the fact that among the polls that were conducted that caused the most, it was mostly conducted by the Prime Minister's own department. 3 of those studies that were ordered over the last year cost altogether $2.2 million. Prior to the Trudeau government, it was rarely seen or almost never seen that the private council would spend so much for polls. So, yeah, I have to say that sadly we don't know why those polls are being ordered, but we know that the government is trying to understand something in the field, but we sadly don't have the questions and we don't have the data neither.
So, Nicolas, one thing I like to try and avoid is a scenario where I would complain no matter what the decision is by the government, right? So, at times government does things, they do things that are unpopular, and we complain. Why is the government doing this? Nobody wants this, right? And now they do polling to try and figure out what people want, and I'm complaining, why are you spending our money, right? So what's the balance there, right? It's because governments do need to know what Canadians want at times.
No, exactly. Like I said, we can understand that the government must sometimes use those consulting firms. What we don't understand is why there would be an increase of such expense. And it's also worth noting that there's already many polls that are being made outside by private firms and other organizations that are trying to see trying to understand what is going on in this country. And we don't need polls to know that there's currently food banks that are being overwhelmed. We don't need polls to show that there's an entire generation that is currently unable to buy a house. We certainly don't need polls to understand that the government spending is one of the main drivers of inflation. It's actually ironic to increase spendings per polls, only to learn that your increased spending is part of the problem. So, of course, like you said, we expect the government to try to figure out what is going on with their policies and how they're affecting people's life. However, that they would outspend any other government before, and that they would outspend themselves suddenly out of the blue, that is quite questioning, I would say. And the fact that, it's not like they're providing any form of reassurance with the people about the policies that they're working on. And I want to make also another thing clear about that, is that if we go back to March and April, there was many polls that were conducted around the country that were showing that the top priority for Canadians was to launch a public inquiry on the foreign intervention into our democratic elections. Mm-hmm. That being said, that was a top priority before Joe Biden visited our country in Ottawa. But the thing is, even though it was a top priority for Canadians, the Trudeau government never engaged in that direction. So it's very hard for us to know what they're actually looking for. Yes, they're trying maybe to fix some things. Maybe they're really trying to understand the pulse of the population. But are they really listening? That's another question.
And let me ask you this, because it seems like it's not just the federal Liberals doing this. Lots of governments are on this sort of a polling kick. The CAQ government here provincially, they use polling extensively. What do you think is behind this? Not just the Liberals here in Ottawa, but just governments in general relying more and more on polling.
I think that's something that would add to the overall bad sentiment of the people about politics. We expect our politicians to be there with a platform, with ideas that they have pushed during the elections. We are voting for those policies at first. Of course, those kind of polling sometimes to try to understand how those different policies are impacting people. For example, the CAC did a couple of polls to try to understand if their tax cut was actually good for people, if they were feeling some kind of change in their life in terms of savings. So I can understand that every government would try to do that. But what is also very questioning and something that the CAC also did in the past is that they would order more polls right before the election. Mm-hmm. And that is something that is quite questioning because, of course, those polls are not being ordered at the current moment by the Liberal Party of Canada. They're being ordered by the Trudeau government. And it's still a legal way for the government to actually obtain data right before making a push either for controversial policies or even leading us to an election. Of course, at the provincial level right now, I don't think we're going to be facing an election. And if we look at the current pollings in Ottawa, I don't think we're going to see an election this year neither. That being said, we still need a justification for those increase in expenses for the pollings or health. The government in themselves needs to answer to those questions.
Nicolas, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your time.
You're welcome, sir.
That's Nicolas Gagnon, Quebec Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation.